Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the World Government Summit COVID-19 and Government webinar series. Before I introduce our session today, I would like to remind everyone that we do have live Q&A, so please do send your question in, mentioning the country you are sending your question in from and the organization if possible. Today's session is titled, What is Needed to Accelerate Wellbeing in a Post-COVID-19 World? Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our esteemed moderator for today, Elizabeth Cousins, President and CEO of the United Nations Foundation.
Thank you so much, Reem, for your kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here. Good afternoon and good morning to everyone. I'm Elizabeth Cousins. I'm the President and CEO of the United Nations Foundation, and I'm delighted to moderate this conversation today with two individuals who have dedicated their lives to the very topic we're here to discuss: how to accelerate human dignity and well-being in a complex and interdependent world. We're talking today in the immediate context of COVID-19, in a world that is reeling from an unprecedented global pandemic that is still in its early stages, and that has touched already every dimension of our lives, our economies, and our societies. You all know the figures: over 7 million cases worldwide, over 400,000 dead, estimates of a global contraction that could cost the economy trillions in the next 2 years, global poverty rates threatening to increase after years of decline, acute food insecurity that threatens millions, and fear that we have yet to see the worst as the virus hits the developing world. But the context is far deeper than COVID-19 alone. We face a climate emergency that is even more colossal in its implications, a planet whose human life support systems are under extreme duress. And we face deep demands across all of our societies for greater equity and justice, too long overdue and often denied. So we are truly in a pivotal place, at a pivotal time, and we have profoundly consequential choices before us. For leaders in all sectors, government, business, labor, philanthropy, civil society, that makes this also a time of strategic opportunity to show foresight, to take risks, and to deepen the partnerships across sectors that can advance human dignity, equity, and well-being for generations to come. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, talks about this opportunity as one of building back better. Our World Government Summit hosts today describe it as accelerating well-being in a post-COVID world. But either way, the stakes are high, and that's what we're here to talk about. Well, we couldn't have a better or a more distinguished pair of panelists to take up this question, and I'm delighted to be joined first by José María Figueres, the former president of Costa Rica, current president of the Carbon War Room, and a lifelong champion of sustainability. José María has been a true pioneer in sustainable development, leading innovations across sectors on issues ranging from digital technologies to healthy oceans. And his career has spanned leadership across all the critical issues we are grappling with today. We're also joined by Peter Bakker, president of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, a global CEO-led organization of over 200 leading businesses working to accelerate the transition to a sustainable world. Peter is a distinguished business leader who has led companies and initiatives to drive sustainability, and he too is a true superhero for a sustainable world. And we're going to start the conversation with our esteemed panelists, and then we'll open the floor for questions, and then we'll go back to our panelists for some closing thoughts. So let's dig in. Let me start by asking each of you how you assess this moment and what's at stake. You know, well before COVID-19, we knew 2020 would be a pivotal year. People were talking about it as the super year to kick off a decade of accelerated action on the Sustainable Development Goals and climate change and the transitions we know we all need to go through. So tell me how you were thinking about 2020 pre-COVID and how you see it now. José María, let me start with you.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for your very kind introduction. Thank you to the World Government Summit and the government, of course, of the United Arab Emirates for organizing this series of conversations on the moment we're living in and the challenges ahead. So I looked at 2020 with a tremendous amount of optimism. Climate change was on the radar screen for the first time, just of about every major corporation in the world. Governments were much more preoccupied with moving in that direction. We were looking forward to the COP15 of biodiversity that was going to be held in China during the fall of this year. And this year was also going to be fantastic for the ocean, for the conservation and improvement of the health of the ocean. And then all of a sudden, we get hit by this crisis, which found us really not in the best place to be at the beginning of a crisis. In geopolitical terms, with much more tension than we had ever lived since the coming down of the wall. In economic terms, with very low digit growth, which is not sufficient to bring millions of people that need to come out of poverty. In environmental terms, with a crisis, the numbers are very clear. You have mentioned the challenge of climate change. And then in terms of human rights, with over 70 million people displaced from their communities because of internal conflict between nations, and even climate change. Then comes the crisis. And so we were not in the best of positions to be. And of course, with the crisis, a tremendous amount of unemployment, a tremendous amount of poverty, which we had eradicated, and yes, the challenges ahead of us. But you know, Elizabeth, I choose to be optimistic. In spite of the difficulties and the challenges, I want to be optimistic. History has taught us that when we have gone through a crisis, we have come out and accelerated events. Sometimes not in the best direction, like after World War I, but certainly many times in a very good direction, like after World War II. The creation of the United Nations, you chair the foundation. The creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, of multilateralism. And if we were capable of doing it back then, I have the illusion that we will come together after this crisis and again advanced in accelerated steps. And I look forward to talking about that in this conversation.
Wonderful. Well, this is a truly open moment in history, I think, as we've had them before and often in moments of deep crisis. So I think that charge for optimism and possibility is exactly the one that we should bring into this conversation. Peter, let me turn to you. How do you see the year ahead as it was and as it is now?
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, and great to see José María online here, and thanks to the World Government Summit for bringing us together. I think you were both right. You know, 2020 was set up to be a super year. Finally, real action around nature loss, climate action, stakeholder capitalism. You know, to be honest, it sounds like 3 years ago, but it was only like 4 months ago that we were all in Davos, where the central theme was stakeholder capitalism as the real driver for the changes the economic system would need. But then COVID happened, major shock none of us in our lifetime have experienced. Like we said, you know, disruptions in supply chains, businesses shut down, mandatory by many governments around the world. I believe at one point more than half of the world's population was sat at home, working from home, completely disruptive to the way we work. Inequality on the rise. You know, the 40 million unemployed people in the USA. I was reading in the New York Times the other day, 120 million women in India unemployed since the COVID crisis. So inequality is, of course, starkly with us. And it's like many times in, you know, when an airplane crash happens, it's seldom that only one airplane crashes. Always in the next few days, another crash will happen and some other event will occur. And I think the recent events that we have seen unfold in the USA is that other crash that has happened. And, you know, I think it is now bringing us all to the position that the world is much more vulnerable than we thought it was. Go back to the global risk report that came out in January that had not a word to say on pandemics and the disruptions it could bring. And like José María, I'm actually hopeful. If I look at the business response to the COVID-19 crisis, I see three big drivers in business. The first one is how do we respond to the crisis, i.e. take care of the health of our employees, our customers. The second one is how do we recover from this? How do we restart business where and when it is possible in a way that is healthy and safe? But also what are the economic recovery scenarios, the stimulus packages that are being put out there? But most hope I actually get from the now serious conversation about reinvention, building back better, and we can talk about that later, but what do we need to do to now finally and fundamentally change the systems in which we operate? So yeah, it's a big moment, like you said, Elizabeth.
Let me thank you very much for that. And I think, you know, you both spoke to the overlay of so many different issues that are playing out in real time. People live their lives in the round, and so they don't just experience a health crisis, they also experience an economic crisis, or they may be in the middle of an equity and exclusion crisis. So everybody is experiencing these this moment and these issues in a very holistic way, and our solutions clearly need to be shaped by the same spirit. I'd love to ask you both a little bit more from your respective vantage points. You've worked across sectors, both of you, government, private sector, civil society, a little bit more about how you see the relative roles and opportunities for leaders in those sectors. You know, the COVID crisis has been a huge test for governments, with some pretty dramatically falling short, others really excelling, a crisis that nobody expected to have upon them. And since the start of this crisis, we've also seen exceptional leadership, not just from some governments, but also from the business community in areas. I mean, Peter, you mentioned some of these, ranging from procurement and supply chain innovation to research and development, which we all know is so critical to getting ahead of this virus, to the extraordinary financial contributions we've seen business make to the work of the World Health Organization. That's some of the work we're very involved with. So I wonder if I can turn, José María, first to you. You've led a country. How do you understand the opportunities and the impediments around leadership in a moment like this? And if you're sitting at the top of a government, what can business and civil society or citizens do to incentivize governments to do the right thing?
So, Elizabeth, I want to start off by saying that I think that before the crisis, we were all, in a way, traveling a very precarious, slippery, slightly downhill slope with respect to many of the global challenges, particularly moving fast forward on the eradication of poverty and inequity, which Peter addressed and where I agree with him completely, and also with respect to climate change. So one of my aspirations is that as hard as the crisis has been for millions of peoples around the world, that overall the shock will also take us out of this slippery slope, status quo, sense of ease or uncomfort, but not sufficient to get us to move to finally tackle these issues. And these issues that we have in front of us, being able to combat poverty, for which we have, in the first time in humanity, the wherewithal from a technology point of view and from an economic point of view, being able to look and tackle inequity, and then moving fast forward on the climate change scenario, bringing down our emissions and going to a new, modern, technologically driven, low carbon economy. I want to believe in my optimism that we will be shaken so much by the crisis that we will understand that is a path forward. And in that path forward, governments have to think big. Their first responsibility here is with respect to their people. This is no time for business as usual macroeconomics. And fortunately, we see many governments around the world investing heavily in making sure that there is no hunger or that it is dramatically diminished, and that people have the basic needs to live a life, even if constrained, with, as you said, dignity. Bringing dignity back to lives, that is a first consideration of governments. And a second consideration is to have a medium and long-term vision of how their countries are going to come out of this, move towards that low carbon economy, become much more competitive than they were in the past, create the quality jobs that the world needs today in order to move forward. And that can only be done in partnership with the business community. It's not governments that create jobs. Governments can create good regulatory frameworks that send clear clear signals to markets and make markets operate and act much more efficiently. But it is the private sector that has to pick up on that with its entrepreneurship, its capital, its skills, its leadership, and create this new modern world free of poverty where we mitigate climate change. And in that, I very much agree with Peter. He mentioned it, I jotted it down here, stakeholder capitalism. I love that expression. I love the expression of progressive capitalism, with which Joe Stiglitz has been talking about in the recent months. We have to reinvent capitalism as we go forward.
Thank you. And you know, that's a high charge, and it's the one that I think we all take deeply to heart as the opportunity that this moment gives us. So Peter, that's a perfect layup to you to say a bit more about what you think business leadership and business leaders need from governments. I mean, José María has spoken about some of that, setting the regulatory framework, setting the market signals, creating the kind of medium to long-term vision for where economies and societies can go in the best interests of all of their citizens. But what do you see business needing in terms of those signals, and what more can we do honestly to create the right kind of demand signals and momentum around some of these shifts?
Yeah, I would say the important part is for business itself to recognize that this shock is not a standalone shock. You know, I think it was only published this morning by the World Health Organization and the UN that the cause of pandemics is directly related to the stress we put in nature. Mm-hmm. So the deforestation and all these other things that the global supply chains that are mostly run by businesses are responsible for. So we have to take on board that sustainability is more important, not less important. We need to reduce the stress on nature. We need to get to net zero carbon by no later than 2050. And if recent weeks have shown us anything, we need to get on top of inequality. Society will just not allow business a license to operate if we do not address these particular issues. Once you integrate that into the strategy, the decision-making, the governance of business, it becomes very easy to be a voice of change towards governments. So we need to make the voices of progressive business much more heard than the ones who are trying to protect the status quo. That's one big responsibility and in terms of leadership. Secondly, though, and that is a warning that the World Health Organization, David Nabarro in particular, keeps making to us is, do not think that COVID is over. You know, he's even a bit firmer than that. He says, we're only at the start of this. So we must keep our guard up. We must make sure that our employees, our customers remain healthy. And when it comes to what do we need from governments, we really need to work with governments to design these stimulus packages that are being put in place now, these big financial support arrangements, that they are actually building back better, that they are investments in green energy and circular economy and in job creation where it's possible. And the last thing we need to do, and that's a very fundamental point, that's the point that José María also made, we have to stop making speeches about stakeholder capitalism. You know, it was in November last year that 182 CEOs in North America signed the statement by the Business Roundtable that we would move from shareholder to stakeholder capitalism. 6 months later, more than 20% of the population, the working population in the USA is unemployed. How stakeholder capitalist is that? We must stop talking about it, we must implementing it. And we need to work with governments to now put the regulation in place that makes this stuff mandatory. That's the only way that we're going to get this fast enough on the tracks.
Yeah, I hear you both speaking very much essentially about the politics around these changes, about really important issues of accountability and follow through. and ways that the many years of good impulses and good initiatives that many of us have been involved with in various ways can actually accumulate into something that has both more traction and is more decisively forward moving in a way that can't be rolled back. I think that really is a challenge to all of us in every sector as we face a moment in time very much like this. I'm going to ask you another set of questions, but I also want to remind all of our listeners, please do send any questions to the chat room that you will have, because we'll eventually come to you as well. But let me ask you both a little bit more about this Building Back Better idea. You've both spoken to it. It's something that the UN has made a hallmark of their thoughts about the forward strategy for the UN system. And one of the critical early tasks is clearly to make sure that these huge stimulus and recovery packages, you've both spoken about this, they're all being written now, that they put climate-friendly, planet-friendly, people-friendly investment and jobs at their heart. Though I think we all recognize, for reasons you've both also said, the pressures may readily be to default to older models because the political need for immediate action is so great, and that leads people to fall back usually on what they've done before, not on what they should do next. So how do you see us laying the groundwork for what decisions really need to be taken next in governments, in the private sector? Where do you see real leadership and bright spots? Just eager to hear how you see that landscape and what various of us can actually do to try to move in the right direction. José María, I'm going to go to you first.
Thank you.
And you come from a family of determined optimists, I know. So, so tell us where we see the best grounds for optimism.
I see you read Christiana's book. Thank you. So I think that Peter staked out some of the challenges here and also some of the opportunities. Peter talked about being net zero by the year 2050. And I want to build on that, Elizabeth, because I believe that at this point in time, what should guide us in the way we put together these recovery packages and the different investments that were talked about and that Peter alluded to, is what should guide us is a medium and long-term vision of the society we want to rebuild into, the society we want to be. So 2050 net zero with respect to carbon emissions is a wonderful place to be. That is a wonderful world. 2030, to bring it closer into home, is a wonderful world if we can be carbon neutral by the year 2030. The World Economic Forum has this wonderful program of planting 1 trillion trees. Now, so far, there is no technological piece of equipment or machinery that is more effective in sucking carbon out of the atmosphere and converting it through the process of photosynthesis into biomass than planting of trees. How many trees can we plant? 1 trillion trees around the world. Think of the opportunities, think of the job, think of the capitalization. So staking out a world that is carbon neutral by 2030 and then net zero by 2050 is a fantastic objective that should align our policies. With respect to the ocean, because we cannot speak about climate change without speaking about the ocean and vice versa. They're both two sides of the same coin. You know? The ocean is our most important ecosystem on the planet. We should go back and rename this planet Ocean instead of Earth. It is 70% of the surface. It gives us 50% of the oxygen. Every second breath in our life is courtesy of the ocean, and it fixes 25% of carbon emissions. Think of the economic value of that environmental service. So with respect to the ocean, putting 30% of the ocean under marine protected areas by the year 2030 would do enormous benefit in terms of recovering the health of our most important ecosystem, which, by the way, is also a tremendous economic contributor to global GDP. So let's stake out medium and long-term objectives. Where do we want to be 10 years from now? Where do we want to be in 2050. And then with those stakes in the future, let's design the policies that are shorter term to make sure they are all aligned in the direction of that society and planet we want to rebuild into.
I think that's so critical, that question of the affirmative vision of the world we want to live in. You know, the SDGs also gives us part of that in a very powerful way. And it was not very long ago that every country on the planet signed up to them. So some governments have changed, but their people and stakeholders all endorsed and embraced that vision. And that's something I think that's really worth remembering as we go into the moment that we're in. Peter, let me...
And Elizabeth, I'm sorry if I may interrupt you. And some governments that are not living up to the SDGs will also change. That is one of the benefits of democracy.
That is what we have elections for, indeed.
Yes.
Peter, can I turn to you?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think short term, we have to make sure that these stimulus packages are indeed aligned with the SDGs. And I would simplify it to keep everybody on board. There's three big challenges that we need to address: climate change, get to net zero by 2050, nature loss, no more loss of nature after 2030, and inequality. Those are the three big buckets, and the SDGs are the framework to manage all three of those, by the way. Fundamentally, longer term, like I said, we must change the economic system. The system that we have does not cover well enough the damage we do to the environment or the inequality that exists. And you know, we now all seem to put the label of stakeholder capitalism on it. But like I said before, we should stop talking about it. We need to make it real. And what does that mean from a business point of view? Businesses need to integrate environmental and social risks into their risk management systems so that they make better decisions. They then need to integrate the results of those decisions into their disclosures. Capital markets, i.e. investors, financiers, need to allocate their capital according to which companies make the most sustainable decisions and have better integrated results. Cost of capital for sustainable business has to be lower than for businesses that do not want to play sustainability. And then you'll create a tipping point in the economy that everything will be aligned and will move fast forward. And then we're building back better, which, by the way, I was in another Zoom call earlier in the week. Somebody very forcefully said, we should not talk about building back better. We should building forward better. And that's actually something that I reminded is probably a good thing to hang on to.
And building forward different is the other expression. So absolutely right. And very helpfully, you've both also outlined very concrete, practical instruments, tools, policy steps, et cetera, that, you know, we know what they are. They need sustained attention, they need decisions around them, and they need implementation and follow through. And that is such an important charge for the moment. I want to ask you one more round of questions before going to our audience. About equity. You know, you've both raised it, and we all see how COVID-19 intersects with and exploits other disparities and inequities, whether that's racism or poverty or other exclusions and vulnerabilities. And I know you both agree, and you've often said that the inequality we've just seen skyrocket in recent years is one of the most corrosive threats we face to democracy, to sustainability, and so on. Yet at the same time, we also have powerful new tools to bring a much more diverse set of voices into the conversation and to bring important and neglected debates to the top of the agenda. So I'd love to hear you both just reflect a little before we go to the audience about what more you think we can do to give meaningful voice and power to new players, to build greater diversity and representation into our strategies for sustainable development and planetary action. And how do we not squander this incredible opportunity we have before us to reset, to rebuild more equitably?
Mm-hmm.
Well, whoever wants to go first.
I can go.
How about you?
No, I would argue two things I would probably say. First, again, taking the lens of business, we need to really now drive the conversation around the future of work much more concrete than maybe we've done to date. We all know that technology changes will come to society. Many jobs will be replaced by robots, artificial intelligence, and the like. At the same time, an enormous amount of new jobs will be created. It's now well known that if you invest $1 in renewable energy versus $1 in fossil fuel industry, you create up to 10 times the amount of jobs for that dollar. So building back better in the green world is going to be much more job enriching, but we need to reskill the people. And that's, I think, the biggest challenge that business now needs to take on. What can we do to allow a just transition for all people from the jobs they may have today to the jobs that are available tomorrow? I think if it comes down to elements like racism, business has a step to make to really understand what their role in that is. I think the wake-up call is incredibly loud and clear, and hopefully will not ever be forgotten again. But the practical steps that we need to make to be a part of the solution for topics like that really still need to be designed. But in an organization like mine, we had our board meeting last week. We talked about the composition of our board, of some of the governance elements, and this was the biggest conversation we ended up having. So yeah, I think the eyes are open, we're wide awake, but work to be done to get concrete in action.
Great. Wonderful. So we have a lot of questions now coming in from our audience, and I'm going to try to cluster a few where they seem to be similar. So let's get right to them. So first, there are a couple of questions about whether there are trade-offs between the low carbon economy and the sustainable economy of the future and immediate economic needs. One question from someone who is watching from India asking about that balance between holistic human development and business and economic needs that may use scarce resources, and a related question about whether the goal of enhancing a low carbon economy can be detrimental to economic growth and value. So how do you see that question of trade-offs? And I know this is what you've dedicated your lives respectively to, so just say maybe a word about that and then I'll go to some other questions.
Peter, you first or myself?
I took the last question. Your turn.
All right. José María, you're up.
Let me put it this way. I do not see a future for humanity unless we move to a low carbon economy. Full stop, period. The planet will go on, but the planet will go on without us. And so this is not a, should we do that or should we do something else? No, it is having the moral fortitude to do what we know is right, to do what science tells us we need to start moving because we're already behind the curve. This is about internalizing all of those so-called economic externalities, which is what we have called some components of the environment and some issues dealing with societal progress in the past. So this is not a trade-off situation anymore. This is, we need to get this right and build forward, as Peter says, better. And the only way to do that is moving towards a low carbon economy. I see three objectives or three things we need to solve in that movement forward. They are poverty, inequity, and climate change. And Peter has alluded to some of them. They all have different instruments through which we can begin to tackle them. Poverty. I hear many conversations that I had never heard before in many parts of the world speaking about a minimum family income, un ingreso familiar mínimo, that allows people to live with dignity and that allows them to be an economic participant in the global economy that we are trying to build back much better than the one we had before. Why should we continue to try to grow the economy with so many billions of peoples around the world, that cannot be, let me say it in very crass terms, that cannot contribute to that economic development. They cannot buy, they don't have any purchasing power. They're not actors in the real sense. No, let's give people a possibility to be a player. Let's attack poverty in its root cause. Let's rethink and retool how we have tried to do that in the past, not as successfully as I think we should. And let's begin to think of new approaches. The issue of inequity, or of growing inequality that has been with us for the last 15, 20 years, in spite of the progress that we have made, in spite of the millions of peoples that we have brought out of poverty around the planet, we have also grown inequity in the Northern Hemisphere and in the Southern Hemisphere. And the issue of inequity needs to be studied a lot more in terms of how are we going to solve it? We're not going to solve it through wages. We have to solve it through the creation of capital, through the creation of equity, giving people a level playing field with respect to their equity on which they can build and move forward. And the issue of climate change does require us moving very strongly in the direction that Peter has already mentioned of renewable energies, of a circular economy, and of doing the things that scientists tell us we need to do. So this is not, as if I understood the question correctly, if or what is this trade-off? No, the trade-off here is, do we want to live on the planet or do we want to perish? That's the trade-off. If we want to live, we have to get with it and move in the direction that we have been talking about.
Great. Peter, do you want to add anything before I go to some more questions?
Well, very quickly, I said it before, $1 invested in renewable energy is 10 times the jobs as in fossil fuel. So the business case for moving to a zero carbon world has been made. The job creation is bigger in that side. But I can understand the question, if you are working for an airline, which is fighting to keep the jobs in place, you would want the government to support the airline business to go back up and fly the way they did. And we need to, I think governments have a major role to play in communicating to its populations why a decision to move to greener solutions is going to be good, not just for the planet, but also for job creation. And there's massive opportunities: renewable energy, natural climate solution, building portfolios that we have around the world. So we must really not, and I think in the past, if I'm honest, even in my own job, in my own organization, we're occasionally too focused just on the environment. And what COVID has learned us, we need to really bring integrated solutions, things that are good for the environment and that create jobs for people. Then we can mobilize the people behind it. The business case is clear, the economic case is clear. It's like José María says, we have no choice. If we were shocked by the shock that COVID brought, wait till climate change brings its shock upon us, because then COVID will look like a small event.
Right. No, and I absolutely. And I think actually both of you, and José María, you in particular, also already answered a question that was posed by a colleague from the UAE about inequalities in pay and access to basic services, which you really forcefully already addressed. So I just want to acknowledge that comment. I have a question from someone watching from Egypt. Peter, to you. How do you foresee or advise on the practical integration of ESG into metrics, into sustainable social investment? What are the real driving forces, and what do you advise to try to get greater traction in that area?
Well, I would say we need three things. I've called that the triangle to capitalism. The first one is we need to agree the science-based targets. In climate change, we've done that, 1.5 degree net zero by no later than 2050. The second thing we need to do is we need to fundamentally change governance. So TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the work of Mark Carney and many others, needs to be made mandatory. So to all governments watching on this session, please come to COP26, support Mark Carney, TCFD mandatory in all countries in the world. And then the third thing that needs to happen is we need to agree a standardized set of ESG indicators. The World Economic Forum is the IBC, the GRI, the SASB, all the groups that are working on standardizing the language that we will use to talk about the progress we're making on environmental and social issues. Once we get that triangle to work, science is clear. Every business is managed based on that governance. The language we use to talk to capital markets is all the same so that it becomes comparable. Then capitalism will flip, and that's how we're going to change the economic system.
Wonderful. I have a number of questions about different levels of government and what can be done. So, one question from a colleague in the UK asking, of all the different changes that different governments have made just in response to the COVID-19 crisis, which innovations should stick, which things should not stick? That's one kind of question. I have a question from a colleague in Ireland asking about where you see some of the brightest spots and energy at the local government level. And obviously that's an area where we've seen also incredible dynamism on the climate and sustainability agenda as well as a question from a colleague in Egypt, or calling in from Egypt, about the G20 and what should happen at that level of kind of global governance. So it's a whole bucket around governance, but maybe if each of you could take one piece of it and speak to one aspect of those questions. José María, why don't I go to you first?
Well, I'll speak to the G20 part first. The financial crisis we had back in 2007, 8, 9 would have been much worse if we had not been able to count on the G20, the 20 leading nations of the world, that's the G20, to coordinate macroeconomic policy for the planet. And we can go back and assess if they did it in the best of ways, if we made some mistakes or not. But the truth is that their leadership and their coming forward really helped the world a great deal in not going into a lot more trouble and in coming back faster than we would have. This year's G20 summit, if I am not mistaken, will take place in Saudi Arabia. And as never before, there is a need, a huge need for multilateralism in this world. The geopolitical tensions that we are seeing help no one in their own countries, and certainly not the planet. That is a very selfish attitude. We need a lot more multilateralism. And I truly hope that then when the G20 comes together, they will come out in a position of high moral leadership with a very concrete plan, as concrete as possible amongst nations when they come together, to help the world move out of this and into a green economy. And that's the opportunity that Saudi Arabia has to exercise true leadership in the world. They will be remembered for the leadership that they exercise in being able to move the G20 in a positive direction.
Peter.
I would probably add to that when it comes down to the G20, we all look at the tensions with great concerns, but I'm hoping that meeting can focus on where do we have agreements. The 1 trillion trees planted project has already been mentioned. Every government in the world can rally behind that. The Saudi government calls that the circular carbon economy. Let's make a plan to go big on circular carbon economy. It can reduce world's emissions by 38%. That's something we can start tomorrow. We'll create jobs, we'll reduce carbon, and we can move on that. More hope I actually have from engagement with cities. And we all know that 70% of the world infrastructure is in cities. If we work well with city governments through platforms like C40, ICLE, and others, we can really scale solutions on the ground, which will be better for the population, better infrastructures going forward. And then the last thing I really would like all of us to do is look at the new cities that are being built. Pyongyang in China is building a new capital. Indonesia is building a new capital for Jakarta. In the United Arab Emirates, experiments have happened. Let's look at these examples. Let's copy what works. Let's improve what doesn't work yet. And let's scale it up as fast as we can.
Thank you both. I'm so struck in all of the questions that are coming through, and I'm trying to get to as many as possible, but they're phenomenally rich questions. But in everything that's coming from the chat room and from you both is just the hunger for leadership in the world, the diversity of sources of leadership in the world, and the opportunities for leadership at a moment like this, where, you know, those with the foresight and the vision and just the willingness to roll up their sleeves in the right way, you know, this really is such a generative moment in our world and in all of our societies. Let me turn, there were a number of questions. There are quite a number of comments about the impressive track record of Costa Rica. I have to tell you that, about topping the Happy Planet Index as many times as you have. And a real appreciation to you both, and José María, to you in particular, for the emphasis that you're putting on issues of human dignity. A number of comments also that have come in about mental health and well-being, and just how to think about people in the most well-rounded way and really support and serve them in that way. Comments and thoughts on the kind of human face of the challenge before us from you both. And then one final question, and I think we'll have to turn to closing comments. But to that.
Well,
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead, Peter, please.
No, I was going to say the one thing that that the COVID crisis has brought to our organization, and I see the same happen in all the companies that I work with, is it has made our operations way more human, even though we are all working remotely. So we may not see each other in the same building or in the same factories, but we call in every day to check whether people are okay. If we have news that people are not okay, we will offer them support. It's become just a whole lot more human. I think the big challenge that now lies upon us, how do we maintain that attitude and that sense of belonging to each other? And how do we take care for each other as we move through the COVID crisis? Because again, let's not make the mistake that COVID is behind us. In many parts of the world, it is only just starting. And let's really now get serious on this agenda of inequality. It begins with putting back the people who got unemployed into jobs as soon as possible, because without a job in many parts of the world, you have no livelihood. But then secondly, get to the structural points. And José María already gave us some of the solutions that are out there. The reskilling, the having a decent income, having access to equity, that we need to now really put on the agenda. And I think I'm actually optimistic. On this one, I'm optimistic. On climate change and whether we can get all the governments rallied behind it, politics will decide in a little while. But the fact and the shock that we have seen that this brought to people, the fact that COVID, and that's in my mind, probably the most important lesson. We can talk about climate change and nature loss, but for many people, those are far away type of conversations. COVID has brought health and the shock to the system to every doorstep, to every family. And I'm hoping if we can tap into that energy and bring real solutions there, then we'll have a good chance of changing the world.
Thank you.
So to what Peter has said, which I would subscribe fully to, I would add that perhaps this crisis, the shock that we have gone through, the personal knowledge of friends that may have lost their life or have fallen extremely sick, or those that we know that have lost a job, and in losing the job, a good part of their livelihood. Perhaps all of that has also made us much more aware of the empathy that we must feel for each other. You know, Elizabeth, too much fighting in the world of the past. The world of the future has to be about loving each other, about cooperating, about showing empathy, about helping each other in a true, earnest, passionate way that helps others and fulfills us by giving part of ourselves to others. And I hope that this crisis will not only wake us up in terms of our responsibilities with respect to poverty, equity, climate that are so important, but with respect to higher responsibilities that we have with respect to each other and helping us live in a better place.
Thank you. Well, I want to go to each of you, even though those were rousing, almost closing statements in themselves, but just to go to you each for any closing reflections, and I'll just wrap into those a couple of additional comments that have come through the chat room. You know, there are a number of comments about what are you most worried about, and I think you've expressed a lot of that already in our conversation so far, and some searching questions about whether it's possible for us to learn. Can we learn if we're not forced to learn? Can we learn as societies? Can we learn as governments? And what are, you know, the main messages that, as we close out this session, that you would have, whether it's to governments or business leaders or to citizens? So let me turn to each of you maybe for a quick round of closing reflections, even though this is the start or the continuation of an ongoing conversation that we are all having in various ways, and that you are both such exemplary leaders of. Peter, let me turn to you first, and then we'll close out with José María.
Yeah, I would probably say two things. You know, we all talk about building back better. Let's make that
better.
real.
Building forward better.
Building forward better, building forward different. But let's make that real. Let's not make the mistake of just talk about it, feel good about it, and then move on where we left off. And that means there are three things we need to put central in everything we talk about. What are we going to do to stop climate change, i.e. net zero by 2050? How do we stop the loss of nature? And what are we doing to get on top of inequality? And we can do that in a business, in a government, in whatever organization we may work for. But we have to remember it starts with yourself. Every choice you make one that is good for the climate, that does not destroy nature, and where you can help equality forward. Make it personal.
Thank you. José María.
So let me begin by thanking again the World Government Summit and the government of the United Arab Emirates. I feel that there's fantastic value in holding these conversations, broadening understanding, getting more people excited about the opportunities that we have forward. I also want to recognize Peter's leadership at the helm of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I mean, Peter was such an exemplary CEO at the companies he has led in the past, and he has just taken this organization way beyond in terms of its global responsibilities. And thank you, Elizabeth, for your work at the United Nations Foundation. I feel privileged to be living in the world of today. I know that many of our global compatriots are having a very rough time, going through a very downgraded patch in their life. But I want to say that humanity has never had more instruments to pull itself out and move forward than we have today. And that begins with a change of attitude in each one of us and the way we look towards the future. In spite of everything, I want to look to the future with optimism. I want to look at my fellow human beings with empathy. And I want us to work together in building that world that we know is possible. Thank
you. Thank you both so much. And I'll just make a very brief closing reflection, because it's impossible really to do that after all of the conversation we've had so far. But just to say this, we are all so often in situations where the debate is framed in terms of tough choices. Protect public health or save the economy. Focus on the emergency or prepare for the long recovery. Protect your own citizens or help those beyond your borders, people or planet. Well, if COVID-19 is showing us anything, it is showing that these are, and they need to be, false choices. So you both said this earlier, we are long past living in an either or world. We are living in a both and world. And that doesn't mean trade-offs go away, but it does mean we need to reject simplistic trade-offs that get in the way of mobilizing our best collective imagination or our highest ambition in addressing these fundamental issues of human well-being and dignity. And that's, of course, what the SDGs are all about. They're all about both and solutions that can move us faster and farther toward a fairer and better world. So I just really want to thank both of you personally. My warmest thanks to both of you, José María Figueres and Peter Bakker, for your time and candor today, for the leadership you have shown in the world and continue to show, and your dedication to making this shared world a much better and fairer place. And I want to thank our hosts at the World Government Summit. This is really an exceptional platform for ideas and solutions and for sharing. And we're really just grateful to you for making it possible for us today. And thank you to everybody on the line who has joined us. Be safe, be well, and be ambitious and be personal. So Reem, let me hand the floor back to you with gratitude.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Peter. I think one thing, this session has been extremely insightful, and I think it goes back to how do we accelerate well-being and how do we accelerate change. And I think it comes down to three main things. One is the human of all of us in us, our individual, but also caring for the well-being of all of us. The second is even the well-being of our globe, our ecosystem, our biodiversity. And the third, the well-being of progress itself. We need to take care of the well-being of progress to actually get somewhere. So I think, thank you for everything. And I think that's a beautiful summary to actually going back to Peter saying, getting things done. We need to get things done. And I think after this session, I hope everyone, and I think even through the Q&A coming in today, everyone has been really engaged. So thank you and stay safe. For everyone, we do have a session tomorrow. We talked about today accelerating well-being. Tomorrow it's slightly different. Designing, and how do you design with government and the beauty of design. So today we hear about the well-being. Now let's try to design that tomorrow. Everyone, stay safe and take care.